Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. The structure of this event will first be an introduction, then a lecture and discussion with Dr. Reese, and lastly, we'll have time to answer any questions and take any comments. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to type in your concern in the messenger box and we'll address it there. Questions for Dr. Reese will be answered at the end of the discussion, but feel free to write your questions, make a comment. Um, you can type it in the Q&A box there or the chat box there. We'll monitor both. And we will answer them at the appropriate time. All right, let me introduce to you Dr. Debbie Reese, enrolled at Nambé Pueblo. Dr. Reese's research on Native peoples and children's literature is taught in English, library science, and education classrooms in the United States and Canada. Dr. Reese's education started at the day school at Nambé. Her blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, is widely recognized as a leading resource for teachers, librarians, parents, writers, and professors. She is a co-adapter of an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People, which won an honor award from the American Indian Library Association and was on numerous best of book lists in 2019. Please welcome Dr. Debbie Reese. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. This is my title slide, Representation Matters. That's my logo. And it's January 19th, and if we were in person, we'd all be in Santa Fe at the public library there. I am going to ask my hosts to advance my slides, so you'll hear me saying that as we go through the evening. So, Kunta. That Kunta is thank you in Tewa. That's the language we speak at Nambé. Here's a quick guidance tip. In books, it was typical to see native words in italics like this. You look at that sentence there in the middle of the page, I have the word kunta in italics. But today, publishers are moving away from using italics for non-English words because an italics typeface conveys the word is not an English one. A not italicized typeface centers English and it makes it the norm. So we're trying to get people to move away from using italics in children's books and young adult books because it says these people are not white, these people are not English speakers, these people are not like everybody else. So it's a way that the font that you see in text can otherize people who are not part of the mainstream majority population. So I have the point is made very well in a video by writer Daniel Jose Older. So you can go and see his video later. And I think that Jessica's going to send out the link in a chat message perhaps. But anyway, so I'm going to try to drop information as I can throughout the evening. Next slide, please. Yeah, so when I was talking with the folks at Santa Fe Public Library, they sent me a list of questions that they wanted us to talk about. And so I have taken those questions, put them into the slideshow, and we'll answer them using the slides. So why do I study children's lit? And the answer is, man, I was one of those kids that really liked to read. I went to Nambé Day School up at the reservation at Nambé. Some of you have probably been up there. And I loved reading. In this picture on this slide, you're looking at Tip. That was a basal reader that I learned to read in. And every time I see Tip, my heart goes pitter patter. It meant a lot to me. All the Tip and Mitten, the kids in there, Jack and Janet. I just have very powerful memories of that. So Tip is what I read when I was a kid in 1964 in first grade. There on the right, you're looking at my teacher in first grade. That's Mrs. Egger. She's a white woman from the East Coast. And that certificate I'm holding was something I received at the end of the year because I liked school. I did great. I made good grades. So I got the certificate that year for having the best grades. So I had positive associations with learning to read, and it meant a lot to me, reading. And so reading and children's books have become a really significant part of my life. Next slide, please. So I was there in New Mexico, and in 1994, we left Nambé to study so that I could study family literacy at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where I am this evening. I'm talking to you from Urbana-Champaign. Click, please. When we moved here from the Pueblo, and we our second year here, we rented the second floor of that house that you're looking at. And I remember in those early years thinking really fondly about, wow, I'm living in a house with a pitched roof and there's big leafy trees everywhere. And then I realized, you know what? That's the work that Tip was doing on my psyche, on my emotions, on my heart. I thought like I was like in heaven or something, but I really wasn't. Why? I was having those very positive feelings of affection for a house that looked like that, and not the house that I was born and raised in, said a lot to me about the power of image and how it can go deep into your heart and affect you and how you feel when you go out beyond your own community space. So that was one thing that I realized soon after moving to Champaign, Illinois. Next slide. Click, please. The other thing that I realized that was how much a mascot shapes what people think about who Native people are. We were told about this mascot. This is Chief Linawick, who was the mascot at Illinois for all of 87, 89 years or so. This Chief Linawick, and you can see him in his fringe buckskin, and he's adopting that posture with his arms raised to pray to the Great Spirit. It was riven with stereotypical ways of thinking about Native people. Look at that. He has no shoes on. He's wearing all that fringe buckskin, and he's wearing a long headdress. And that's not, in fact, what the Illini people, there was a nation called the Illini people, the Illini Confederacy. They didn't dress like that. This is more, of course, what you hopefully you recognize as Plains Indian kind of clothing, because it's not quite accurate. The way he's dressed, or the way that any mascot is dressed, is generally in this kind of plain style, which is full of stereotypes. So I became aware of how much that mascot was affecting people in Illinois, because I wanted to talk about Nambé. I wanted to talk about what we did and what life was like for us there, but they just wanted me to come and tell stories. And I said, I'm not a storyteller, I'm a teacher. Well, can you dance? No, no. When we dance, it's like prayer. It has meaning, and I can't just go and do that. There's ways and times and places that happens, and a football field is not it. So people didn't want to hear from me because I wasn't giving them what they wanted to hear. I wasn't affirming their quote unquote honoring or their love of Native people as given to them by something like this mascot. Next slide, please. So there you see George and Martha. Some of you will recognize this is George and Martha by George Marshall. It's a very popular series book series of books that feature this hippopotamus named George, and Martha, his partner. And he's wearing a headdress like Chief Linawick, and he's holding a tomahawk, and he's got this loincloth thing on, and he's got his hand up like he's going to say how. And I came to study family literacy, but once I saw how much this mascot was shaping how people were thinking, I still wanted to work within children's books. So I started looking at children's books to see if I could find any connections between a mascot and children's books. And boy, did I. I found them in one children's book after another, ones that people hold very dear, ones that are very powerful and that you find in libraries across the country. So this one, in fact, became a book that is part of my presentations, this page in George and Martha, because when we left Nambé, my daughter was 3 and she came here and started kindergarten, and I went to get her at school one day, and she came out of her classroom and threw her backpack down on the floor, and she said, "Look, Mom, it's George," because by then she already knew about the George and Martha books. And she said, "But look, he's dressed like an Indian." She was just mad as a 5-year-old kid could be, because she had already participated in our ceremonies. She'd already danced at home. She knew what feathers mean to Native people. And seeing that in a book she got from the library meant a lot to her. I mean, it impacted her. So stereotypes were everywhere, and on the football field, in children's books, and in society. You can see them in Peter Pan. I just started looking and noticing how prevalent they were. So next slide. I stopped studying family literacy and started studying representations of Native peoples in children's books. One of the things that I realized right away is that there were more books that had stereotypes of Native people in them than books that were accurate depictions or authentic depictions of who we are. Over time, people have been doing a lot of data collection and analyzing what is published in children's books. So this slide is about numbers. It's not about quality. It's just what gets published. This is the infographic called Diversity in Children's Books 2018. It shows, if you look on the bottom right corner, in the gray print, the CCBC, which is the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the School of Education, University of Wisconsin-Madison, has been collecting data for decades. And this was the data from 2018. They had 3,134 books come in at the time that the infographic was made that came out in 2018, and they sort them according to how much page space a character has. So the child on the right, the graphic is showing mirrors, because there's a concept that you've probably come familiar with, especially in more recent years, that books can be mirrors. If you see yourself depicted in a children's book in some way, that book mirrors you, it affirms you. And when you sort the books, when CCBC sorts the books, they found in 2018 that half of the books that they had received showed white children. So they had an array of mirrors. So you can see that, like the disco ball and all kinds of mirrors that a white child can look at and see him or herself depicted. If you look on the far left, you're looking at a Native child. The Native child had 23 books that year. Out of that 3,134 books, 24 had enough Native content in them to be called Native books. I want to go to the next slide so we can talk about that a little bit more. So there's that Native child on the far left, and I have that blown up. His mirror is really small, showing you that there are not that many books out there. But if you look at his feet and at the feet of the other children in the infographic, there are shards of glass down there. That captures the idea that books can be mirrors, but a lot of those books that come out each year have problematic content, stereotypes and bias in particular. And I want to talk about the sample of books from that year, 2018. I looked at the quality of the 18 books of fiction that were published that year in the United States. There's a lot more books published in Canada that have good Native content than there are in the United States. Canada subsidizes, the Canadian government subsidizes book publishing, and so a lot of small presses in Canada are run by Native people, and they create some terrific books. If you come down to the United States, you don't have that. We don't have that in the United States. What we have are the major publishers and some smaller ones, but we have very, very few that are run by Native or people of color. So anyway, I took those 18 works of fiction that were published in the United States in 2018, and I broke them down. And of those 18, 10 of the books were by Native writers. So we're going to look at that. When I read those 10 books, I was able to recommend 8 of them, because 2 of them, even though they were by Native writers, they were not ones that I would recommend, because sometimes Native writers are writing outside of their own particular tribal nation identity, and so they tend not to do justice to the Native nation that they're writing about. So who writes a book and what they write and what they say is important. I think that Native writers who are writing from their own traditions do a better job of accurately depicting that. So we recommended 8 books of those 10 in that year. And when you break that down, those 2 that I did not recommend were actually published by a major publisher. That was Dutton and Penguin. Those are major publishers, and major publishers have big advertising budgets. They can send out lots and lots of copies of the books to bloggers who will write about them. They can send money to the bookstores who will put an end of the row big display of the book. So when you have a book published by a major publisher, it gets lots of visibility. The other 8 in that set were that I did recommend are from small publishers, but they don't have that budget. They and I recommend them because I think they are done very well, but they don't have the budget that a major publisher has. So click to the next slide, please, or the next, yeah. Non-native writers, on the other hand, of those 23 books that year in the fiction category, non-native writers had written 8 of them, and I read them, said no to 7 of them. 5 of those were published by major publishers and 3 were by small publishers. But those, what I hope I'm getting at, hope it's clear, and it may not be at all because I sometimes don't know that I'm making one bit of sense. When you have a major publisher publishing non-native writers, those books with problematic content are more likely to be visible to everybody and in your libraries, being assigned to your kids to read in school or that they will bring home when they go to the library. Bad representation, in other words, misrepresentation, biased representation, stereotypical representations are more likely to be seen by your children than accurate and authentic images and stories of Native writers and Native kids. So it's important that we not look just at the numbers, but at the quality of the content. Now, I want to say a little bit about the character shown here. This little boy, I helped create this infographic, and the first time that the image was drafted, the infographic was drafted, the illustrator had the character dressed in a certain way, and I thought, oh no, that doesn't look like a Native kid. So I thought, okay, how am I going to convey this? And I just wrote to my sister, and I said, Georgia, what's Jaden, that's her grandson, what's Jaden wearing today? And she said, well, he's wearing a green shirt and he has his red tennis shoes on. I passed that information along to the illustrator and he just used it and made the graphic authentic and accurate too. Okay, so that's kind of like setting the stage for what we see when we're looking at the quality and the numbers of books that get published. Next slide. Okay, so the question is, why did you create a blog? Well, when I went to Illinois and started working as, finished my doctorate and started working as a professor, an assistant professor, I was realizing that the articles that I was writing that looked carefully at children's books were being published in by professional journals that are not available to you unless you join the association that publishes the journal. I felt it was really important that the information that I was finding be available to a wider audience. So I created a blog in 2006 where I could just push the information out there. All you had to do was know that it existed and you could come there and see me talking about Little House on the Prairie. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or really good children's books like this one here, Nibi is Water, is one of the best books from last year. So the blog lets me push information out using social media, that's what it is, in a way that I think has meant a lot to a lot of people. And there are people who are doing studies that say that, yes, this blog has made a big impact in what gets published. So next slide. Oh, right. The question is, are libraries neutral? Are books neutral? And the answer to that is no. My answer to that is no. And I think there's a growing awareness that libraries are not neutral. Who created the categories that books are that are used to categorize books in any library? I think we should go to my next slide here. So I think, yes, okay. All right, so let's, this looking at folk tales, that was one of the questions that the my hosts at the public library wanted me to look at. Because it's one of the things I write about. And I think looking at categories by which books are shelved can help us see that. So what we're looking at here is the catalog entry for Mary Pope Osborne's book, the Random House Book of Bible Stories. And there's a summary there, and look beneath the summary is the subjects. It says Bible Stories English, Bible Stories English, Bible Stories. You can look at any library catalog and find this kind of information. What I want you to do is look at the subjects when you're looking at what we're looking at here, which is folk tales. Next click, please. Okay, so here what we're looking at on the bottom is Beaver Steals Fire. It is a Salish coyote story that is told by the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, and it's illustrated by Sam Sandoval. Now, that is one of their creation stories. To them, it is as sacred as those Bible stories are to Christians. But when we compare the subject fields for those, you look at that subject field for the Bible stories and look at the subject field for the creation story at the bottom, and it says Salish Indians, folklore. Kootenai Indians, folklore. Salish Indians, folklore. It just repeats in that way. There it says coyotes, legends. So if you think about that, somebody decided that native stories were just folklore. Bible stories from the Christian Bible are not folklore, but in fact, they're both folklore. Or they're both sacred stories. Both can be true, but we need to rethink that very carefully, what we're doing in the libraries, because when we have this book categorized as folklore, teachers and librarians don't realize that they need to extend the sacred treatment of it that they would extend to Christian Bible stories. And they will then use a book that is actually has really sacred content in it as a fun arts and crafts activity that further helps kids see these folk tales as folk rather than sacred. So libraries aren't neutral. The shelving is not neutral. This is just one example of that. Maybe we can talk about that more later at the end during the Q&A. But this is one of the ways that I think helps people understand that libraries aren't neutral. They feel like they're neutral, but they really aren't, because who made that rule, who decided that they were neutral, was someone who wasn't neutral. Okay, next slide. There was a question about problematic phrases. Words, these are words, problematic phrases are also known a lot. You might see a lot of these called microaggressions. These are words that are similar to stereotypical and biased and factually incorrect images, except they're words. So some examples are low man on the totem pole, off the reservation, circle the wagons, bury the hatchet, and spirit animal. There are many, many more like that, but these are some of the more common ones. Off the reservation, you hear that a lot, especially in the last 4 years in the political conversations that have been taking place, when some political commentator will say, well, they're off the reservation because they're doing something they're not supposed to do. To Native people, off the reservation has a very different meaning. Off the reservation historically meant that a Native person had left the reservation without permission of the agent, and they could be shot and killed, and that did happen. So off the reservation has a very different meaning to Native people. Low man on the totem pole. Some people think that a totem pole has a hierarchical status to it. It doesn't, but the way that it's being used in common conversations says that if you're on the bottom of a totem pole, you're like, you have no status. That's a misrepresentation of what totem poles mean to the people who use them, people who create them. I talk about these on my website when we get to the very end. I think I have a slide that shows the categories of things that I have on the site that you can come and look at. So we'll go on to the next slide. Should authors and illustrators revise problematic content? This is an interesting conversation, and I think sometimes, not necessarily all the time, but when they do, I think they really need to have a note in the book that says that they did that. There should be an author's note added to a book when it is revised, so that teachers can say, you know, it used to have this content in it and that was bad. It turns the book into a even bigger conversation about changes in thinking of how we look at various people. So let's look at a couple of slides here. Click one time, please. Some of you may know the book Amazing Grace, very popular book. People really liked it. It's about a little girl who is told she can't be Peter Pan because she's not a boy and that she's black and Peter Pan is white. So she imagines all the ways that she thinks she can be anything because we can all do that. We can all imagine ourselves as anything. And she does eventually get to be Peter Pan. But Amazing Grace has this page in it. Click, please. Where Grace is imagining herself as Hiawatha. She was Hiawatha sitting by the shining Big Sea water. Now, when I was talking earlier about Chief Lanawick and about that big headdress, there you see that same kind of headdress used here. He was wearing face paint. This character when Grace is imagining herself as Hiawatha, she's got face paint on. She's got her arms crossed. She's got her legs crossed. She's bare on top. Her torso is bare. So you see the stereotypes feeding into the way that Amazing Grace, or the author rather, Mary Hoffman, is helping Grace imagine she can be anything she wants to be. Here, this is very problematic content. And after enough people talking about it, the publisher decided, okay, we're going to take that page out of there. We're not going to keep that page in there. So they took it out of one of the anniversary editions, but there is no note about it having gone away, and some books still have that image in there. So I would like to see that when authors and illustrators or their publishers, because a lot of times this happens long after the author or illustrator are dead, when those changes do happen, I would like to see a very public campaign about the changes to it, so that teachers can use that information to help their students understand that books are not sacred. Books have mistakes in them, and books can be changed. Errors and stereotypes, racist imagery can be acknowledged and removed. Now, what I would like to see people doing here is, if you have a copy of Amazing Grace on your shelves and it has this particular image in it, maybe take a Sharpie and write down there on the bottom, this page was taken out because this is stereotypical information. I'd like people to understand, help kids understand that books aren't sacred. They have problems in them. Okay, next slide. Yeah, what to do if a child is enjoying a problematic book. Click, please. This is media literacy, and I think we've really been having a lot of conversations about this. It's not quite the same thing, but about fake news, and part of what I've seen a lot is people using that word fake or fake news, or being upset because we have made inroads in what is getting published. There are examples of books getting the early copies of them coming out, and critics seeing that they have problematic content and speaking about the problematic content on social media, publishers watching and seeing that and deciding, you know what, yeah, they're right, this book is got problematic content, and withdrawing the book from publication. So there are efforts to try to say, you know what, there's something wrong with that. This is media literacy, being able to look at media, print materials like library books or things you see on television or elsewhere. This is media literacy, looking at it and saying, you know, there's something wrong with this. So what I would do if a child was enjoying a problematic book is talk with the child about that image. I know we get really quickly into the, like, you're shaming a child, and I think one of the ways that you can get past that is, I thought it was good too, but you know what, I learned it wasn't, and I was embarrassed because I thought it was okay. Owning your own state of awareness and your own coming to an understanding of awareness, modeling that idea that, you know, we can recognize something is wrong today that we thought yesterday was okay. Helping people understand that people aren't born knowing. We all have a progression of coming to a different place of knowing. So that's one suggestion I have for that. I'd be interested in other people who are tuned in tonight, what kind of response they might have to that particular question. Next slide, please. Oh, nostalgia. Yeah. All right. So part of the question was also about, what do you do when parents come into the library and they want to share a book that is a classic or something they read when they were kids that you know has really problematic content. So this is kind of the same as the previous question. What's happening there is nostalgia is driving the interest in reading Little House on the Prairie. And if you look at some of the writings that Native people have done about this, and that some other parents have done as well, they try to read that book. They loved it as a kid, and they get it, and they start to read it, and they come right away to content that they know is not all right. and they try to edit it. They think, okay, I'll just edit that out. I'll keep reading it to my kid and I'll edit the words as we go. But there's so much of it that pretty soon it's overwhelming and they just stop. They can't keep going because there's too much of it. So nostalgia brought them to that place where they thought they should read that book, but then actually as an adult who has a greater awareness of problematic content like stereotypes of Native people, reading it, it's hard to keep going when you keep bumping up to it. In this book in particular, there are 3 times when you come across the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And when I have a teacher telling me that they think that, well, that's how they thought back then, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I'll say, well, who thought that? So let's interrogate that question or that statement. Who thought that? Native people didn't think that. And I bet not all white people did either. Some people thought the only good Indian is a dead Indian. So let's back away from that kind of disclaimer or excuse of problematic content by saying, well, they all thought like that. They didn't. Not everybody did. So looking carefully at statements like that is one thing that I think you can do. But the other thing is think about reading that statement out loud to the kids at Pewaukee Elementary School in the 3rd grade, because you know there at Pewaukee, there are Native kids in that classroom. Why would you do that to them? Why would a librarian read that to them? When we know that Native kids drop out of school at very high rates, why are we adding to the burden that any child carries when they're in our care? It's easy to let go of books like that when you start thinking about what you're actually doing, what you're actually giving to all the kids in your classroom, because you're not only hurting a Native child's self-esteem when you read that certain sentence aloud, you're affirming something in the non-Native kid who's hearing that. So you don't have to read books like this. Parents can make other choices. Towards the end of the book, it has to build and build. The drama builds as you keep reading the book. You get to the final chapters. This is from page 290. Indian drums beat faster, faster, and the wild yipping rose higher and higher, faster, wilder. In the middle of the night, Laura sat straight up and screamed. So it's creating this tension and this fear of Native people, but not really people. Over and over, you see them yipping, yapping. They are not presented as Native people. They're not presented as people. They're presented as something different from Laura and her family. So if you think about the way that the people in this story are depicted and the harm that they are doing with these depictions, it's easy to let go of those books. There are other choices. Nostalgia should not be what drives us in book choices. We can talk about that too towards the end of this evening. Next slide, please. All right. Click one more time. That red X is there. Go back. Okay, the red X is there. I use a lot of red X's because I know that you sat here and you were looking at the slide that I was showing you. Little House on the Prairie was there as a visual image, and that saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words. It really has a lot of meaning, and cognitive scientists have been looking at that. Image goes right up to a certain place in your brain, and all the words that I give you about why you shouldn't really be using Little House on the Prairie, those are just words that go to a different place in your brain. What stays very strongly in you is the image. And so I have been using a red X over books that are especially problematic to interrupt that place of that image in your brain, because I really do want people to come out of this workshop tonight, this webinar tonight, going into a bookstore and seeing Little House on the Prairie on the shelf, but seeing the red X too, because I think that can make a difference. Okay, now, next slide. All right, so we are here at the end. This is a look at the top half of my blog, American Indians and Children's Literature. What you're looking at in the middle of the page is the home page and the about and the contact and search. Now, these are all these bars that I have here at the top of the page that go to specific posts in the blog that I think kind of help people find information that they really are looking for. So one of the things that I get asked a lot is, do you have any books that you would recommend? And so there, the fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth tab on that top row is best books. If you go there, you will find links to best books lists that we have done at American Indians and Children's Literature for several years. Each year we do a new list. I also link to the American Indian Library Association's book award winners, because every 2 years they announce their award-winning books, and so I have links to that. So best books you will find there, and I have this one in particular that I've been talking about lately. It's not showing very well as I turn it like that. This is Peggy Flanagan, Ogima, Lieutenant Governor, by Jessica Engelking. And Peggy Flanagan is Lieutenant Governor in Minnesota. So this is her biography. It's a biography about her, and it talks about some of the stuff that Native kids experience every day. So like when you look at this, at the first part, it's recess, and she's outside playing Red Rover with the rest of the kids in her class, but she's thinking about Columbus, because her teacher has just done an introduction to Christopher Columbus, and she's like, yeah, we were here before Christopher Columbus. And she's not fully enjoying her time on the playground, because she's in that space of thinking about what her teacher was just telling her, and that she's going to go back into the classroom and that's going to be there again. She also talks about mascots, because Peggy Flanagan went to a university that had a mascot and what that felt like for her there. So it's a really good biography that kind of gets at the experience of Native kids starting in elementary and kindergarten on up to college. I have lots of best books that I recommend that are by Native writers. So do click on that tab and find that. I also have here the second bullet I have is photo gallery. That's on the second row. There is a perception in American society that Native people have to have high cheekbones and long glossy hair, or maybe high cheekbones, but not long glossy black hair, dark skin. There's this image, this way that Native people are supposed to look. And when you don't look, when a person doesn't look like that, then their identity is discounted. There's people say you can't be Native. So what I have in that photo gallery is images, photographs of Native writers and illustrators that show the range of what Native people look like, trying to get across the idea that being Native is not what you look like. It's about your tribal nation. That's a really important concept too, is that we are not cultures. We are nations of people who have many different cultures, because the language that we speak at Nambé is not the same that it's spoken by the Senecas, for example. There are hundreds of different languages and hundreds of different stories based on each particular nation that we're looking at. So the photo gallery is there to help people become familiar with what Native people look like. It's there to try and dispel the notion that we only have a certain look, because we don't. The third bullet I have there is a timeline, foul among the good. There are more children's books that have problematic content than there are books that don't have that content. So when you look at the foul among the good page, you will see that there are books like Clifford the Big Red Dog. Everybody likes Clifford. He's like Clifford. He's the big red dog. But there is a Clifford's Halloween where Clifford is dressed like an Indian. There are many examples of that. The Richard Scarry books have many of those. So I try to show you a chronological timeline of that kind of imagery, and that it hasn't stopped. We still see that in children's books. It still occurs, and it only is going to stop occurring if you, the book buying public, say, hey, this was not okay. And I want you to use social media to say that, because publishers are paying attention. Publishers want you to buy their books. And if you buy something and you don't like it, how about sending it back and saying why you're sending it back? Because it has a stereotype on this page. Those kinds of small things that all of you can do will help shape what gets published in the future. The fourth bullet is two problematic phrases. I mentioned that earlier. You can go there and look at those. Revisions to racism, we talked about that a little bit too. And the last one there, tips for teachers developing instructional materials, is a one-page PDF that you can download and use in your classroom or hand to teachers. Use it. This is one of the things that we have created at American Indian Children's Literature that are meant to help people do a better job in teaching and learning to see what we are seeing, learning to see the stereotypes. All of that, all the work that I have been doing since I left Nambé Pueblo in 1994 has been trying to help people see us, because people too often don't see us. And too often people will pick up a book like this, like the biography of Peggy Flanagan, and it's not about her dancing and being in ceremony and all of that. And so people think, well, she's not really an Indian, because Indians really, they're like dancers and drummers and storytellers, and we're so much more. But the stereotypes have forced people to come to thinking of us in very narrow ways, and that has to stop, that has to change. And you who have tuned in tonight, you 158 people, you can help make that change. So please use social media. Go on to Twitter. I know, Twitter's scary for me too, but use the social media in ways that can help make a difference. Now I'm going to stop talking and we can have some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reese. We definitely have a lot of questions. So I will start with, I think, is the first one we received. Dr. Reese, could you please clarify on your comment, Canadian government subsidizes publishing for blank? I didn't catch the whole statement. Thanks.
Okay. When you pick up a book, let's see, I wonder if this has a statement in it that is published in Canada. No, this one doesn't have it. There will be a statement that says this book partially funded by the Canadian, and then it goes on to talk about what part of the Canadian government subsidized the publication of the book. It's an arts council of some kind that has a fund set up for art, for the creation of art, and Native people can tap into that and publish children's books that accurately reflect people of the First Nations in Canada. Does that get to the question, you think?
I think so.
Okay. I kind of talked fast sometimes, so.
Another question. I'm curious how the little boy was originally dressed in the 2018 children's book diversity illustration. Did the illustrator initially draw him in a stereotypical clothing?
No, he made him kind of like, I think he had like a button-down shirt on and some kind of funky shoes. You know, that's what it was. It wasn't stereotype. It wasn't stereotypes. No, because we had worked with the illustrator before. This is somebody that is really aware of how stereotyping looks, and so we knew that was not a risk. There was no problem. He was going to do that right, and he did do it right. It's just that he didn't know what Pueblo kids dress like. You know, most Native kids are like in t-shirts and tennis shoes and so that's all that was. But I liked being able to say, "Hey, Jaden, look, this you."
Yeah,
Jaden's from Pewaukee Pueblo.
Oh, Jaden. Dr. Reese, thank you for discussing problematic phrases and texts. If you could design a dream syllabus for teenage students, which texts or excerpts would you include?
Is this a question about books that I recommend for teenagers?
It said your dream syllabus, but yeah, I mean, that's your expertise. Do you have literature for teens that would?
Yeah, sure. When you click over at our best books, you will find books that we do recommend for teenagers, and I can show you a couple of them here. This is called A Girl Called Echo. It is this is the second book. There's 3 in this series that are graphic novels for young adults. That's one. So you'll find that under the young adult category. You'll also find this place. You know, these are from Canada. This place is a graphic novel that's actually gorgeous, and it goes from 150 years into the future. There's even the final chapter is set in the future, so I really like that for young adults too. This is new, Apple in the Middle by Eric Gansworth. He is Onondaga, and this book just came out, and this is what it looks like. This, what I've got here with this design around the front, that's not what you'll find in the bookstores. This is the cover, Apple in the Middle. Apple is commonly known within Native communities as a slur. You say that for someone who's like only Indian on red on the outside, white on the inside. So he's talking about that slur, but it's also his family's history and family story. It's a memoir from someone who grew up on a reservation. One of the things that's been really interesting to me when I read Eric Gansworth's books is that he grew up on a reservation on the opposite end of the country from where I grew up, but because we grew up on reservations, a lot of what we experienced are very similar. So I really recommend his books, his young adult books, for readers who are on reservations. I like that a lot from Eric.
Thank you. Kristen asked, and I'm not sure, I don't think this is happening, but maybe you do know. Is there a movement to make the category, when it comes to the Dewey cataloging, is there a movement to make the category religion instead of Bible?
No.
Or maybe instead of folklore, sacred literature?
No, there isn't. And I think that kind of change is going to only come about because of librarians and the work that you all do as librarians. There have been changes to several things. I'm trying to think of one. I think illegals maybe, or illegal aliens. I think that one as a category has been changed in the Dewey system, or LOC, Dewey, I guess. But this is an area of work that has to happen. I know that some librarians around the country who work particularly with tribal communities have not used those categories. They just they just shelve things in a way that works for their community. So I know there are special kinds of libraries around the country that are where that is happening. But to make the change happen that you are asking about, that's up to you librarians.
Thank you. Yeah, Susan asks, are books like Little House on the Prairie reflecting history and beliefs told by someone who lived in the time period versus nostalgia?
I think if we, okay, so that's two questions.
Yeah.
One is it an accurate reflection of that time period? And the answer is no. I've written so much about Little House on the Prairie. There are factual errors in the book. It is fiction, it is historical fiction, but there are factual errors in the book. I think that when we think about fiction and what we expect of fiction, if you get a book, okay, so we're Santa Fe, okay, audience, I'm assuming it's mostly Santa Fe. If something in there, if you get a work of fiction, adult fiction that is set in Santa Fe, and everything is wrong about the layout and about the town, that doesn't work for you. If it's one of your special places to eat that's misrepresented, that doesn't work for you. You know it's not accurate, and you would like other people, perhaps, to know what that restaurant is really like, or where that restaurant is really located, or what the history of that restaurant really is. Historical fiction or adult fiction or any fiction doesn't have to be wrong. It can be right. And what we see when we do a factual analysis of Little House on the Prairie is there are factual errors with the history, factual errors with the representation of the Native people who are in the book. They are shown, if you pick up the book and start looking at it, you will see naked Indians in it who are wearing, there's that one scene where the Indians come into the house and they're wearing skunk skins. They're only wearing skunk skins. There's like nothing, they're not wearing anything else, and they smell bad. Little Laura comes into the house and those two Indians are there, and there's a terrible smell, and she wonders, what is that smell? And then she figures out later it was the skunks. They were wearing freshly killed skunk skins. So the smell she was smelling was the skunk. Now, all of you in Santa Fe, you know what it smells like when you are near where a skunk has released its scent. If you get too close, makes your eyes water. It can make you gag. But these Indian men, what was up with that? They were walking along the prairie and they saw some skunks and they killed them, and they poked that gland and that scent went all over, but they just kept on there skinning, and then they put it on. That just doesn't, that's factual incorrect representation of people who have been hunting and tanning skins for thousands of years. You know, you think about it, it just doesn't make sense. It's a factual misrepresentation. It depicts Native people inaccurately. So the Native people living at that time knew that was inaccurate. Why did Laura Ingalls Wilder write it like that? And why do we as a people today think, oh yeah, that's how they were? It's because we've been so vastly miseducated, in large part by children's books. So I think we really have to look carefully and critically and honestly admit what children's books are doing. Do you think, Jessica, that gets at the question?
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
Anne Ward, she wrote this hopefully just twice. Okay, it's the same thing. She asks, Anne asks, could you talk about your curtains postscript to Rudin Sims Bishop's metaphor for books as mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors?
Yeah, I have added to Rudine Sims Bishop is the person who came up with the metaphor that books can be mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. What I have added to that is a curtain. What we are finding is that publishers really want Native people to include aspects of ceremony in the books that they're submitting for publication. And in fact, we are raised in communities where our ceremonies have been misrepresented by writers, and those misrepresentations have been used against us. That is why so many Native people's ceremonies became secret or went underground. They were protected from white people because white people were misrepresenting them. So we have been raised by saying, okay, we don't share this thing with everybody. This is for us here. It's not for everybody. Because when it gets out there, people are going to not understand it and they're going to use it to hurt us. So the concept that I'm trying to bring there is that there are things we don't want to share. So we'll draw the curtain on the things that we don't want to share. And we reserve the right to keep certain things private. Any family does that. Any religion does that. It's not just us. People are protective of certain things for valid reasons. Those reasons have merit. So that's what I'm trying to do with the idea of curtain, is trying to help publishers move away from the idea that every book has to have ceremony and people in ceremony and doing this and that ceremony, to understand that there are things we keep private, and that because we don't, every book that has a white child who happens to be a Catholic doesn't have you going into the Vatican and seeing all this, whatever happens in the Vatican, or what a pope does at every ceremony. It just doesn't happen. And it should not be the expectation from Native writers either. Sadly, many writers will say, you know, they really wanted me to put some ceremony in there, and they said if I didn't, then they weren't going to publish it. So it puts writers in very awkward positions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Kristen, they ask, how do we know which folklore books are more than that, as to create a sacred literature section? This will be a change I will make to my library this spring. Thank you.
Yeah, this is an area that we need to see. We need lots of guidance and a lot of writing. It is something that I'm bringing forward, but I haven't written something out that says do the X, Y, and Z. I think what I would do if I was working in a library right now is I would take a book that is from a Native person of that particular nation. So like the example that I used about that Salish story, I would say, okay, these are Salish people. They know what they're doing. Then this one is going to be called a sacred text, and I'll put it over there with the Bible stories. I'll take it out of the folklore section. So that would be the criteria that I would use. If I'm Pueblo, I'm from Nambé Pueblo. If I wrote a story about the Senecas, I'm out of my lane. I don't know enough about the Senecas. I don't know what they think is okay to share and what's not okay to share. Part of that curtain idea is there are things that we don't share. And if you grow up there, you know what that is. Outsiders don't know that. Outsiders to another nation, Native writers outside of their own nation don't know that either because they didn't grow up there. So I think that when we're going into this ceremony or traditional stories, that we are on the best possible ground if we look carefully at the writer and see if the writer is writing about their own nation. And if they are, we are going to put trust in that writer that they are doing something that is okay, that they know what they can share and what they can't share. And that if they overshare, the people of their nation will talk to them about that. It will be something that they are accountable to their nation for having done or not having done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
And if you want to write articles about that, if you want to talk about that on social media and what you're doing, please do, because it can become part of that conversation, how we're going to move everything to a different place.
I'm just gonna ask a few more questions before we wrap up because we're getting close to time. Let's see. Is there an organization that reviews adult books from the same perspective you are reviewing children's books?
No, I get that question a lot. I have so many questions from people asking me to review adult books, and I don't really do that. I don't have time to read all the children's books. I will on occasion look at an adult book, especially when it is getting made into a movie or something like that, that I know it's going to shape a lot of people's ways of thinking about Native people. I will do it then, but no, there isn't, and there needs to be.
Melinda writes, can you please speak to what should be done with books that are not acceptable? Should they be eliminated from libraries and bookstores entirely? How do publishers react to your organization's responses to some of these books?
Okay, we're talking about Native people, and we're talking about a society that knows very little about Native people. And so things that you have on your shelf are going to play a role in what people read and how they think. So if something has bad information in it, then yeah, I think you should deselect it or weed it from your library. I don't think you want to circulate that. And I think that one way that you can think about that is if you think of, for example, depictions of women over, for far too long, it was barefoot and pregnant and women couldn't be scientists, women couldn't be this or that. And we've moved there, and we don't see like a predominance of barefoot and pregnant women who are not very bright. We have moved from there because people said no to what was coming out, and we're asking for something else. So I think that this points to the importance of people asking for something else, something better. If you try to think about other peoples historically who have been misrepresented and marginalized and how we have moved past that. So like, how many copies of Little Black Sambo do you guys have in your library? Right? You understand that that is a problematic book. Yeah, it was very popular. Yes, people really liked it. But you know what? It's racist. So we don't have it. It's not in very many libraries anymore. We need to come to that place of action with Native books and the content of Native books. So what are publishers doing? When I write about a book like, let's see, here's an example. Code word courage. This came out a couple of years ago. This is the kind of analysis that I do. I read through here and I've got all these tags that are sitting here, and then I write about those tags and write about that book. Now I know, because writers have told me, that they kind of watch and hope that their book doesn't show up on my blog, because then they'll know they messed up. And that I have heard from writers who told me, oh, I am so sorry. They write to me and say, I am so sorry, I messed up, but I can't say anything about it, because the publishing people are also watching, and they will tell their writers, don't you dare say anything about her review, because if you do, you are publishers care about their reputation. And so if a writer in their publishing house says, yeah, I messed up, that's disparaging the publisher and the publishing house, and there's a clause in their contract that says they won't do that. So these are very legal and interesting conversations that are happening behind the scenes about what gets printed. But those writers know now that they have messed up and they're not going to do that again. And that's not the case for all of them. If you look at the tab changes to books, I have that's one of my pages on the blog. Some writers will say, you know what? I have the totem pole thing in there. I'm sorry. And I'm going to make sure that doesn't appear in the next printing. So people are paying attention and changes are happening. Some books don't get into a second printing, and so there it is. But people are trying. People are paying attention. And that's why you have to talk too about what needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Debbie Reese. We didn't get to all of the questions, but I do believe a lot of you who asked questions can find the answers at Dr. Reese's website. That's American Indians in Children's Literature blogspot. I'll put that there in the chat box. You'll find more answers, more resources that you'll find very helpful there at Dr. Reese's website. And
Dr. Reese, do you want to share your Twitter information and other social media so people can follow you there?
Okay, on Twitter, I'm Deb Reese, DEBREESE. I'll also say that a lot of what you see on the website is there because a librarian or a teacher wrote to me and said, can you look at this book? Sometimes it's a question from a parent who says, my kid was asked to read this book, can you analyze it? And I will do that. So it's a service kind of thing, but I was raised that way, that, you know, you work with community, you work with people, you try to help them when they ask you for help. So if there are things in your library that you want some help on, write to me. On the contact page, you'll find my contact information there. Write to me and I will do what I can to help you. It does make a difference. You know, parents in Alaska wrote to me about the basal readers, and so I helped boost that particular conversation. And I think it was McGraw-Hill eliminated that set of basal readers, supplemental basal readers. So speaking up makes such a difference, and I'm happy to help with any of that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, and definitely take advantage of Dr. Reese's important resource online. It's been critical for me as a librarian to continue to learn, unlearn, and use her resource as a guide when selecting children's literature. Thanks to Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library for sponsoring this event. Huge thank you to Dr. Debbie Reese for your work and educating our community and other communities. Be sure to check Santa Fe Public Library's calendar for more upcoming virtual events, and definitely save Dr. Reese's blog as a tool for you in your literature endeavors. Anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Just thank you for coming. It's a big night. It's a big moment in this country's history. And so thank you for coming, and let's move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone stay safe, read books, educate, and have a good night.
Bye.